Welcome back everyone to Decoding Lightroom. I am Adam Welch. Today we are going to be talking about an enormous update to Lightroom Classic that dropped with build V10. We're going to be talking today about color grading. If you've done any kind of video editing before, any kind of video post-processing, then you probably know a little bit about color grading, or at least what it is. But if this is the first time you've encountered color grading with this new build of Lightroom Classic, don't worry, we're going to explain everything. Namely, we're going to tell you what color grading is, how it is different from split toning, because it is replacing our beloved split toning panel. Color grading is going to be the new split toning. There's a lot of pluses to it. You're not going to be losing anything. We're going to talk about how to use the color grading panel. We're going to talk about the presets, the compatibility with your old split tone presets, and we're going to show you literally everything that you need to know, as always. So let's head over to the computer and we're going to actually color grade an image inside of Lightroom Classic version V10. It's going to be fun. All right, we are inside of Lightroom Classic's Develop module. As always, let's take a look at the version. I mentioned a bit earlier, this is Lightroom version V10, Lightroom Classic version 10. Color grading is only available in Lightroom Classic version 10 and later, so keep that in mind. So let's jump right in here and talk about color grading. If you'll follow me right over here into the development panel section, you have color grading located where split toning once was. Again, let me reiterate, you must have Lightroom Classic version 10 to have the new color grading feature. So what is color grading? Color grading, simply put, it is a way for us to add individual color tones to the highlights, the shadows, and the mid-tone luminance values of our images. You can do virtually limitless combination of colors. It's just a way that split toning has been expanded inside of Lightroom. If you do a lot of video editing, or if you edit videos at all, you'll know that color grading has been a long standby in the videography community, and now we have the ability to apply that to our still images as well. So it's very, very, very cool. So let's jump in here to the color grading panel. We're going to click on that, and we're immediately met with these color wheels. Each one of these controls a different luminance value. You can see we have highlights, the shadow coloration, and the midtones. Now the midtones is what makes color grading stand out from split toning, because if you'll remember in earlier versions of Lightroom with the split toning panel, we only had the options to colorize the shadow areas and the highlights. So now we have midtones, and that's going to add a lot of creative potential for us. So let's take a walk around the color grading panel. As you can see, there's quite a few sliders here, and we're going to talk about each one of these individually. Beginning at the top, we have more or less the way we want to display our color grading panel. We have three icons here, these three little circles, and that of course corresponds to seeing everything at once. Now this is the setup I generally use when I'm working in the color grading panel, but we can go in and individually work in each one of the color wheels just by clicking on its respective icon up top here. Now it's easier to work very specifically and much more nuanced when you're working with these specific color wheels one at a time, but we're going to talk about all that here in just a second. So to switch between the different color wheels, you can either click on the icons and it will cycle through. If you pay attention up top here, it's going to tell you exactly which color of the wheel you're working with. Or instead of using the icons, we can just click to the left or right, and that's going to accomplish the exact same thing, cycling through those color wheels. Going back to our try color wheel view, we're going to see that we have a slider beneath each color wheel. That is your luminance slider. It controls the brightness of that luminance value and thusly the coloration brightness of that luminance value. And you don't even have to have a color picked to control the luminance, or rather to work with a luminance slider. If you look at our image here, I'm going to increase the luminance slider, and pay attention here in these trees. While there's no color, that actually does get brighter or darker depending on how I use the luminance slider, and of course just double click to reset. The same is true for the highlights and the shadows. We can increase the shadow brightness or darken that. And of course, the highlights, same thing there. Moving a little lower, we have our blending and balance. Blending, think of that as the feathering of the color grading effect. It ranges from 0 to 100 and is 50 by default. As I said, think of blending as feathering. It controls how much the coloration and the actual color grading effect bleeds over from one tonal value to the other. A smaller blending number, if you set that slider a little lower, it is going to be more abrupt, not as much blending or feathering between the luminance values and thus your colorations. If you set it at a higher number, that is going to make the entire thing softer, or the gradation between, let's say, the highlights and the shadow color grading. It's going to make that softer, and the same for the midtones. So a little less harsh and a little more harsh if you go to the left. Balance is one of the only things to carry over from the split toning panel. It of course controls the same thing that split toning did. It controls the way Lightroom sees the pixels, and as far as the pixels, their luminance values. It is set to 0 by default. It goes all the way from negative 100 to plus 100, and the higher you go to the right, or the higher you go in value, moving the slider to the right, you can bias the color grading effect to one luminance value or another. Again, this works just the way the balance slider did inside of the old split toning panel. And now, before we get to actually color grading these two images, I want to show you the individual layouts of the color wheels. We're going to start with our shadows. You'll notice you have the color wheel here. And then you have some more dedicated sliders. Now, these sliders correspond essentially to the way you can move your color selector around the color wheel. But this is what I was talking about with being able to work much more specifically. Now we have the sliders. We can move extremely incrementally with the hue and saturation adjustments. The luminance slider is still present. It does the exact same thing. It controls the brightness of that specific luminance range for your grading. And of course, we still have the blending and the balance sliders right here. Now, this layout is the same for the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. But when we go to the global color wheel, we no longer have our balance and our blending sliders, because this is going to be controlling the entire tonal range. So there's not going to be a difference between the highlights, the shadows, and the midtones, and that's going to be a global color grading effect. Think of that more as a toning and an overall toning of the image, more so than the individual luminance values. You've also probably noticed that as we've cycled through the color wheels here, you have a little eye. This is also present on the tri-wheel layout. That just toggles the effect on and off. You can see now I can unclick, the effect is gone, click, and it'll show you the change. So all it is just lets you keep track of your work. And one more thing that's present before we move on to actually grading these pictures. If you look here, this little box, that just gives you a heads up display of whatever color you happen to be choosing for your color grading. It's also worth mentioning that if you don't want to see all these sliders present all the time, click this little arrow and that will take that away for you. It's almost like a solo mode inside of the color grading panel. Alright, so it's time to get down to business and color grade a couple of photos here. We are going to begin with the color photo, and then I also have a black and white lined up here just for the sake of showing you how this works with both color and monochromatic images. I'm going to switch back to the tri-wheel view mode here, and we're going to get back to our horses. There we go. I'm going to, let's say, make the highlights a little warmer. Add in some orange. Just like that. We're probably going to go all out with these examples just for the sake of demonstration. And let's take the shadows. Very cool, very bluish. And what should we do with our midtones? Let's make those slightly magenta. There. All right, so we have three different luminance values graded essentially three different colors. And I'm going to begin with the midtones, and we're going to adjust the luminance just so you can see the effect there. See how that starts to get really bright, but it doesn't affect the other grading adjustments that we've made. Let's park that about there. Let's go to our shadows. We're probably going to take the shadows down to add even more contrast here. I like that. And then lastly, we're going to our highlights. We can brighten those up. I think we're going to take those down as well. We can select the individual color wheels, go in and finely adjust, extremely finely adjust the saturation, the hues, the luminance, probably more accurately than you could by manually moving the color selector up here. And of course, again, all that is doing, all the sliders are doing, is moving that selector for us, depending on the saturation and the hues that we actually want for the photo. And don't worry, we're going to talk about the blending and the balance sliders here when we move to the black and white photo. So that's actual selective color grading, and when I say selective, I mean we're color grading the individual luminance values. Let's see what we can do in the global wheel. And I think you're instantly going to understand what I mean by global. So let's say if we want to totally tone this photo one color or another, let's say if we want to go very cool, and that instantly adds that blue tone to the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. You can go warmer, extremely warm. Now that is a global color grade. And like most other things in Lightroom, if you want to set everything back to 0, we just double click the middle of the wheel. Now let's move on to our black and white photo of the moon here. And we're going to essentially color grade this the same way, but I'm going to show you how the luminance and the blending slider affect this depending on the tonalities. So let's just go ahead and get a grade going here. I think I want to go, oh, let's go fairly warm again with the midtones. Kind of have a sepia tone to the overall image. And with the shadows, you know what? Let's actually reverse that. Let's go cooler with the midtones. Oh yeah, I already like that better. And with the shadows, we're going to warm those up. They are. And the highlights, let's do something crazy with the highlights here. There we go. A little greenish. Kind of a cross process kind of look to this, even though it is a black and white photo. Okay, so our blending, again, more or less controls the feathering between the luminance value areas, and the balance is going to be controlling how Lightroom decides what is a highlight, what is a midtone, what is a shadow. So we're going to use our blending slider, and as we essentially feather less, and as you can see, the colors are becoming more pronounced because they're not bleeding over into each tonal range. If I go the other direction with the slider, you can see that the picture becomes more blended as far as the coloration, because all of those colors are literally blending over into the different tonal ranges. The highlights are blending over into the midtones are bleeding over into the shadows, and vice versa. Now I'm going to leave this on a low blending setting so you can see the coloration is just a little bit better, and we're going to adjust the balance. You can see the effect here immediately, because that is biasing, or Lightroom is biasing its recognition of the tonal ranges more or less. Much more pronounced, less pronounced. In fact, what do you think? Actually, I think I really like, for whatever reason, I like that that look on this photo. Very good. And now you see the power of color grading, honestly, over split toning, because you can work so specifically with all of these different luminance ranges, and you can do so very easily right inside of Lightroom. You don't have to go into Photoshop or another program. It's all right here for you. Now you may be wondering, Adam, Do my presets work with the new color grading? I have all these split toning presets. If you have our contrastly presets that are centered around split toning, I have good news for you, or any other presets, honestly, that center around anything done in the split toning panel. They will all work. I'm going to show you exactly how they're going to work here. We're going to click on our contrastly split tone presets, and we will select a split toning preset. I think split tone black and white specialty number 3, and pay attention what happens over here in our color grading panel. Now all of these presets were made in older versions of Lightroom inside of the split toning panel. Now that the color grading panel has replaced split toning, the edits that are in these presets, these split toning presets, are going to carry over to the shadow and the highlight color wheel. The midtones will not change because, of course, we didn't have that option to colorize the midtones back in the split toning panel. I'm just going to cycle through a few presets here and keep your eyes on the color wheels and see how those change. So, in short, yes, your old split toning presets will work inside of the new color grading panel. And actually, you can resave these presets as a color grading preset and keep those edits and change those edits that you made inside of the split tone panel. So, how incredible is color grading? It makes you wonder why it took so long to get this into Lightroom, but I'm glad it's here. I hope you understand now just how powerful color grading can be. Sure, it is replacing our beloved split tone panel, our tried and true hero of Lightroom Classic, but I think you could see that even though it is replacing split toning, it is adding a lot of power to your processing. Namely, you're able to control not only the balance of the grading effect, that coloration effect to the highlights and the shadows of your images, but you can now control the saturations and the individual luminance values of those grading effects. Not only that, of course, the big one, the big thing with color grading that gives it a benefit over split toning is that we can now control the coloration of our midtones. Now, before we go, I want to reiterate that if you want to use color grading in Lightroom, it is always a good idea to save it for the very end of your post-processing. Don't do it at the beginning before you do your basic edits or anything else, because you're not going to really be able to get a feel for how those color grading effects are really going to affect your image. Your presets for split toning will work perfectly. Don't worry about that. You can bring them in. Everything's going to be transferred over to the color grading panel. It's going to be the same situation, but a little bit different animal, but all those presets are still going to work just fine. We've also added a brand new chapter to Lightroom Mastery. Lightroom Mastery is the text companion to Decoding Lightroom. So you'll have an entire chapter dedicated to color grading with Lightroom Mastery. So that is going to wrap up this update for Lightroom Classic version V10. Color grading finally here in Lightroom. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you next time.